With the eternal state of affairs, life for many of us may feel like a never-ending liminal nightmare, one where waking up just isn't an option. So how does one escape liminality? To vaguely quote that guy who wrote that book, to defeat your enemy, you must become your enemy, which meant that I had to become liminality, a liminal sapiens, or better yet, a liminal space. And so I turned to the image that, as far as I knew, started it all. My new mission? To blend in with the backrooms and become the wallpaper. Because if a person exists but no one can see them, are they really there? There's a lot to talk about on this topic of liminal spaces, so I'll be diving in deeper over the course of this video, and rest assured there'll be a great deal of tension, both of the pre and yarn varieties. First, let's go through the design process while I carry out the mandatory yet maddening task of swatching for what will eventually become a freehand knit garment. Although there seems to be quite some discussion on the origins of the famous image, a reply to the most well-acknowledged post described a madness of mono yellow, and despite madness of yellows being somewhat more accurate objectively speaking, when it came to the yarn for this project, one single shade made the most sense both conceptually and pragmatically. So I chose a light, almost off-white yellow wool to give this garment the best chance possible at a life of fluorescent beige. For the contrasting colour, I went with a light muted green that paired well with the base and added to the illusion of a sickly artificial lighting, all the while still being a pretty cute colourway when taken out of context, if I do say so myself. The original image of the backrooms was naturally pretty unclear, so after further googling, I finally found what appeared to be the wallpaper. The problem was that simply replicating it probably wasn't going to translate into knit quite the way I wanted, so I kept on looking. Luckily, the backrooms are popular enough that there were plenty of interpretations out there that worked well, and I realized I could just come up with my own version of the pattern, specifically one that suited my chosen medium. So that's what I did. Already I'm seeing that it's a little too wide for my liking. It's worth adding that I was still unsure of how to construct this garment, but had at least decided against a sleeved sweater and for a sweater vest. Somehow, I felt the silhouette would add to the nostalgic feel because it reminded me of clothing I vaguely recall from now retro television. As you can likely tell, historical accuracy didn't matter as much as the feels did. With the flat swatching complete, it was time to start a sample in the round, not only to compare tension, but also to figure out the transition from rib to pattern, or more analogously, dusty old carpet to wallpaper. So some of you might be wondering, what exactly is a liminal space? Liminal spaces in the contemporary sense exist together as an internet aesthetic, and are by no means limited to the backrooms. They can be photos of abandoned malls, hotel hallways, and school corridors after hours. Empty playrooms, playgrounds, and even just bizarre places you may never have even seen before, despite how familiar they may feel. There's even an entire subgenre of fake liminal spaces created to give the same energy. They are, for the most part, places of transition, hence the liminal, be they literal walkways or places visited in childhood, a time when, by definition, everything was transitory. At the very core of this aesthetic, these images seem to evoke feelings of isolation, of being trapped and or suspended in a sandbox located somewhere in the fabric of space and time, often with an uncanny resemblance to a collective past. They form what I can only describe as an aesthetic purgatory, if you will. And you might be thinking, that doesn't sound so bad. And maybe it isn't. We'll get into that later. The best way I can describe the effect of the more nostalgia-driven imagery is that it's like recalling a vague yet deeply felt memory, but not knowing how much of it was actually based on real life, versus how much was taken from dreams, passively consumed media, and the cultural zeitgeist, past and present. After all, isn't dreaming the original no clipping out of bounds? I guess we'll have to wait for dream technology to advance a little further to find out. Besides, it could be sooner than we think. Anyway, the final swatch worked out and the tension was similar enough to that of the flat swatch to not have to worry about it anymore. However, a proverbial spanner entered the works while I was sampling the pattern, and I was reminded that the chevrons would look different depending on which direction I knitted them in. Oh no. The top middle stitch here is a normal V, and I think it would be nice if it turned into an A. From the top down, the points would be pointy, as they should be, but from the bottom up, the same points would be slightly rounded instead. So after some haphazard risk assessment, the safest option seemed to be to start from the top and work downwards. Or so I thought. To become wallpaper, one must think like the wallpaper. So this panel began with a simple straight edge. I also used the provisional cast on because in the 21st century, commitment is only for the committed. Wait, that's not... Multiple hours later, this was my progress. And well, let's just say that despite the astronomical surge in unshaped neckline acceptance online, I felt bamboozled. There was no way this was going to work, especially given the appalling lack of stretch. This, coupled with the multiple unknowns that also came with working this method, was enough to stop me in my tracks, and I began to wonder if top-down, bottom-up systems applied the same to knitting as they did to everything else. Close enough. So I did consider taking out the provisional cast off and working a neckline into this, but the problem with that is that I won't be able to continue the pattern as it is because there isn't really a center stitch. This is my first time using a provisional cast on that isn't a tubular cast on, so that's why I wasn't entirely sure. Of course I could have looked it up, but like, why would I do that? That was it. It was time to cut my losses and give up the dream of perfectly pointed chevrons. I'll also admit that the provisional cast-on was the final nail in the coffin, because it meant that the pattern worked from it would end up being half a stitch off. Ew. It was time to start over from the bottom up. I should add that I only had the poor excuse for a colorwork chart that I hobbled together at the very beginning, so although I could make estimates, there was still no guarantee that I wouldn't have to frog and reattempt more than necessary. And let's be real, drafting a pattern for the whole thing would only spoil the fun. Before you even think about it, there was no way I was going to work both the right and wrong sides for separate panels, and on top of that, seam them together. So let's not even go there. After one last what if, I took my progress off the needles. At the very least, it was a decent sized sample to refer back to. All of a sudden, a cool wave of relief washed over me. But the drain soon cleared and I was confronted with the ominous task of getting a perfect cast-on round of the tubular kind in a fine weight yarn. All I ask is that you hire a time machine, travel back to the not-so-distant past, and wish me luck. It turns out no one did this, which can only mean one thing. We will end up defeating the AI overlords, but in doing so slap ourselves deep into the Dark Ages, forfeiting all possibility of commercial time travel before the inevitable end of the human race. Tell me you didn't see it coming. This new bottom-up approach didn't exactly solve all of my problems. In fact, it created others. Allow me to elaborate. One of, if not the main danger of working from the bottom up is yarn management. Working from the top down made things more improvisable. Not enough yarn? It's a crop top. Too much yarn? It's a dress. But now, I ran the real risk of knitting too much in the round and thus being KO'd by a tragically small neck opening. Not the way to go if it can be avoided. Plus, where do you think the term stitch up came from? Stitching from the bottom up, of course. On the contrary, the following stage was probably the easiest part of the entire project. And although I wish I could tell you that working exclusively on the right side was all smooth sailing, I can't. The reason being that it was really easy to make mistakes with this pattern, so easy in fact that I ended up adopting the first mistake I made into the final design. So I've decided to slightly change the pattern by alternating the shorter dashes with longer dashes, and I think it's going to turn out a little bit nicer. I mean, it's not a mistake if you keep repeating it, but in all honesty, I did end up preferring it. So while I stumble through the next however many rounds, let's revisit the very concept that inspired this project. I guess one of, if not the biggest question about liminal spaces is, what on earth is the appeal? let's go back to the origins of the term. Liminality was initially coined in the early 20th century by ethnographer and folklorist Arnold van Gennep to describe transitional states in an individual's life, rites of passage, so to speak, namely the preliminal, liminal, and post-liminal, the latter being the naturally achieved goal of some sorts, and the liminal being the awkward in-between stage we all know and hate so well. And almost a century later, the term still holds the same meaning. The liminal space aesthetic is used to convey the same thing, but also the state of mind that arises from staying in liminality for too long, i.e. not transitioning out of it.
The coast is clear.
So, from what I gathered, Van Gennep's version posited that liminal individuals have the potential to harm society as a result of their undefined positions within it, but liminal spaces seem to flip this sentiment by portraying the environment as the problem, not the individual.
I know this looks like the same one again, but it's the third time.
What seems to be the difference in today's aesthetic is that these spaces are transitional in the literal, material, and emotional senses, but arguably no longer in the existential sense for which it was originally used. Instead, they exist in a twilight zone, cut off from the outside world as we know it, and don't appear to lead anywhere particularly meaningful. The consistent references to a pre-digital era points to an inherent focus on the past, and not the future. The opportunity to transition into the post-liminal happily ever after is nowhere in sight, and that's kind of the point. It could be suggested that liminal spaces represent the arrested development felt by younger generations, and although life is easier in ways unimaginable to the past, the same could be said vice versa. Now, this is my current interpretation, which may very well change with time, so let me know what liminal spaces mean to you. For now, this is what they mean to me. For the most part, liminal spaces give me a similar feeling as visiting a supermarket in the early hours of the morning. It's often nice and quiet during antisocial hours, but it's also a little unsettling and, more often than not, leads to some questioning of life choices. I could be wrong here, but I think this is a somewhat shared feeling. And when you combine this feeling with a pre-Web 2.0 nostalgia, as many liminal space images do, there is a certain comfort in the illusion of time standing still, even if it's inevitably tainted with the dead horse cliché that things will never be as they once were again. That being said, liminal spaces, specifically the backrooms, emerged from a creepypasta. They are interpreted as an endless maze of abandoned corporate structure, where the only thing to do is to become lost and disoriented. Not the worst metaphor for being thrown into the corporate world built by those who came before us, might I add. It's hard not to see how this would be appealing to anyone who finds the concept remotely relatable. I also can't help but feel like old office spaces are relics of what having a 9-to-5 used to symbolize, which, however true or false, still sounded better than what it means today, and I think this adds a sense of longing to otherwise unsettling scenery. Would it even be far-fetched to suggest that feeling drawn to places that have no beginning or end is strangely comforting in contrast to an unfamiliar reality where time continues to progress even if you don't? On the other hand, your 9-to-5 might truly suck, but at least you're not being chased through the backrooms by an unknown entity. In some way, it makes total sense to be besotted with images of decayed childhood and inescapable corporate mazes. They are two sides of the same coin, and to borrow a wonderful phrase, real recognize real. After knitting in the round for approximately half a kilometre or a third of a mile, I put my progress on the stand to see where everything came up to. Although this height was fine, I still wanted to add a little more to make the fit less cropped. Less teeny bopper, more grandpop. Next, I began the armhole shaping by casting off, which in turn separated the round into 2 parts and 3 soon-to-be panels. I then slipped off the front stitches onto some scrap yarn, leaving the back stitches on the needle. Now, you may think that hardly any thought needed to go into that, but you would be sorely mistaken. Here's the thing, by working from the back first, I could procrastinate against using the more costly parts of my brain because thinking is an expensive hobby, and well, not in this economy. And to further delay the inevitable use of brain power, I also frogged my earlier top-down progress since I didn't really need it anymore. For any thrill seekers wondering what it's like to see your life flash before your very eyes, watching the stitches you spent hours of your recent life making just disappear into thin air is quite the exhilarating experience, let me assure you. I wasn't sure how this back panel was going to pan out in the sense that it may or may not end up involving some shaping at the top.
Finally.
But either way, it was less complicated to figure out than an off-the-cuff V-neck. After only a couple of rows, I was boldly reminded of just how much easier working in the round was. Having to go back to knitting the right and wrong sides was comparable to an emotional seesaw. With the highs came the lows, and with the lows came a sea of floats which made it near impossible to tell what in the name of Neptune was going on beneath them. Okay, so it wasn't actually that bad, and by some twisted fate, it was looking just as I had hoped it would from the beginning. Although, if you were to look more closely, you can kind of see how much the tension suffered at the hands of working flat, and those would be my hands, of course. My only hope was that blocking would remedy it.
Now that I finished the back, I'm going to return to the front and start shaping the V neckline.
So I began by picking up stitches from the outer edge. I still hadn't figured out how the decreases would be spaced throughout the rows, but one thing was for sure. I was going to, you guessed it, frog around and find out. Despite the bumpy nature of stranded color work, things were going smoothly, until I decided to be really nitpicky about one small detail.
So on this side, I basically used knit together decreases, and I used SSK decreases on this side. But for the last row, I switched the knit together for an SSK, and I think it looks a lot better versus this SSK. You can see that the yellow is overlapping the green, and it doesn't look as flush as I would like it to be. So I think I'm just going to frog everything and start this side all over, even though it took a really long time for some reason. But yeah, I think it's gonna be okay.
It was minuscule and would probably make hardly any difference once the garment was complete, but not fixing it meant that the small overlaps would still show and automatically become the only thing I would ever see or think and dream about ever again. And well, given the simplicity and ease of everything else, I just couldn't let it slide.
Now that's better.
Soon enough, completing the project was only a matter of time, and given the swiftly narrowing panels of right and wrong side knitting, I found it much easier to work from the stand. Not only did I no longer feel the need to flip and twirl the entire project between every row, I could also see how things fit in real time. Looking back, there was nothing stopping me from using myself as a stand instead, and I kinda wish I'd thought about it sooner. But there's always next time. Maybe this project comes from a desire to blend in and hide, to no longer participate in the Kafkaesque mayhem of modern life. Maybe it's a somewhat pathetic yet deeply aesthetic attempt to hold on to something familiar and be closer to the past than the present. Perhaps there's some truth to that, but there is something else. You see, knit and other fiber arts in and of themselves are what can pumpfully be described as yarnified liminality. But what do I mean by this nonsense? Well, if you've spent any amount of time trying to learn these crafts, you soon come to the realization, sooner or later, that in order to do any of it successfully in the long term, you're going to have to find at least some enjoyment in it. Otherwise, the result just isn't worth what you put in. This means that ultimately, the intrinsic value is the liminal space in between the beginning and the end, and in this case, it's the process of knitting. No matter how confusing or frustrating it might get along the way, the final product is kind of irrelevant because it wouldn't exist without the process, and the rest is mere string theory. If my calculations are correct, in taking things both literally and metaphysically by creating a liminal space within a liminal space, this project might just create a portal to the liminal space archive, where you can visit anywhere in the past just as easily as one might click on a thumbnail. Let's just get back to the project, shall we? Once both sides were complete, I then grafted both front pieces to the back with the Kitchener stitch. Fortunately, after some trial and error, the seamlessness ended up being one of the things I was the most proud of in this entire project. Finally, onto the borders. And long story short, again, I mean that literally, I just knit the waist ribbing but in reverse and for half the length. So instead of starting with a tubular cast on, I ended with a tubular cast off. With this being my first time knitting V-neck ribbing, it was also my first time using the double decrease technique, and it might just be my favourite decrease. It was a little bittersweet knowing that I'd gone so long without making it this entire time, but it's not like I had much reason to. Finishing with a tubular cast off afterwards was kind of awkward, but I still think it turned out well enough. And after completing the final border for the other armhole, I was done. Well, kind of. There were still the final boss stages left, the weaving in of tails, and a vigorous blocking. A little melodramatic, maybe, but allow me to double down. All I ask is that you look deeply into your soul and answer me this. Can you truly say with any ounce of sincerity that these last two steps are not the most difficult tasks of any knit or crochet project? Not because of the time or skill that's required of them, but simply the sheer amount of willpower needed to start them. I didn't think so. Your Honor, I rest my case. Now for the blocking. In the midst of the violent drowning of stitches, there came a moment of stillness, a calm after the storm. My struggle stitches were healed, their excess tension absorbed by their neighbors. It was an almost transcendental experience, and I finally understood that I could learn to enjoy the blocking process one day. Not everyone was happy about it, but there's just no pleasing some. Now the question was, could I finally blend in to the back rooms? Yes? No? This vest isn't green screen friendly. Or maybe it is, a little too much, which means the answer is yes? Oddly, this is one of the more brighter items I now own, and maybe that's a good thing. It's also my very first sweater vest, and I think I've been missing out. Do I feel like a liminal space? Not really. What I can say is that it's giving schlubby chic, and I relate very much to this ensemble. In a sense, now that I finished this piece, I have transitioned from the liminal space or the knitting process, and in a very convoluted and roundabout sense, finally escaped the back rooms. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.